Léon Paul Fargue is known in many anthologies of 20th century poetry. He lived from 1876 to 1947. He was very fortunate in that he studied English as a secondary school pupil under Mallarmé at the Lycée Rollin, and later he became a regular at Mallarmé's Tuesdays in the Rue de Rome. He was a close friend with Ravel, Stravinsky, Satie, Debussy, Larpeau, Valéry and Gide, and he edited reviews with Valéry and Larpeau, and he was a close friend of Sylvia Beach and an early sponsor of James Joyce. He was above all the poet of Paris, and he was legendary for his walk through the city, his late night conversation, and his solitary, almost reclusive existence. Although his poetry is highly esteemed, until recently only a very few poems were ever actually translated into English. I came across his work in what I still consider is probably the best anthology of French poetry with bilingual translations, which is Paul Auster's Random House Book of 20th Century French Poetry, which has been in print for many years and still to me is the best introduction. Fargue's poems are essentially and absolutely prose poems. They are not the kind of poems we're used to in English, and it's interesting that in the introduction to the only collected poems of Léon Paul Fargue, which is a very rare and expensive book which I borrowed from the British Library, which is an English translation of Fargue's poem, translated by Peter S. Thompson. Thompson quotes Léon Paul Fargue, "One is never really cured of one's childhood," and a quotation from Mallarmé, "There is no such thing finally as prose." Fargue's poetry is not a poetry of reality, nor is it a poetry of fantasy. It is somewhere in between, perhaps in the space that the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called transitional space. Certainly there is a sense of memorialising childhood. There's also a sense of the mystical and the sacred and the spiritual, not subjects that would make him a popular poet today. There is no full-length book in English on Fargue. There are 2 or 3 in French. There is an article published in 1935 in the French Review by S.A. Rhodes on Léon Paul Fargue. And Rhodes begins by saying the poetry of Fargue is the expression of a state of grace. I think perhaps Claudel would have felt the same. His work is all of a high standard, and the only way I think to read it is to read a paragraph at a time in French and then the English translation which go alongside it. Most of his poems are not actually titled, but for some reason the ones chosen by Auster are titled. This is Dans un quartier, in a quarter, and this means of course not a quarter in the numerical sense but an area. Dans un quartier quand dort l'odeur de ses jardins et de ses arbres, la rampe du songe au loin lève et baisse un peu de ses accords par ce temps d'automne. In a quarter made drowsy by the odour of its gardens and its trees, the ramp of dreams in the distance accelerates and retards its chords a little in the autumn weather. Quel beau regard se penche sur le blanc calvaire. Quels gestes font chanter les rêves couchés et invisibles. Quelles mains ont ouvert les fenêtres sur des paysages où les souvenirs clignent comme au loin des toits par éclairs. What gorgeous aspects cluster over their pale Calvary. What gestures evoke the chance of latent and unrealised dreams? What hands have opened penetrations into landscapes where things remembered come to sight like the perspectives of roofs seen by lightning? Une lanterne attend son heure au bout de l'allée sablée qui mène à la via perdue sous les feuilles où s'égoutte encore une pluie légère. L'ange est là, son doute au clavier, sous l'aile de l'ombre, et son beau visage et ses mains où les barres sortent leurs griffes à la lumière, brillent d'une flamme qui bouge à peine. A rope lamp bides its time at the end of the gravel walk that leads to the villa, lost beneath the leaves in which a light rain still drips. The angel is there, no doubt, at the keyboard under the plume of the shade, and the noble visage and his hands on which the rings put forth touches toward the light are bright with a steadfast flame. Mais l'oiseau qui souffre et se tait sur un secret désir se prend enchanté dans son panier d'or, un perron d'automne, une villa blanche posée comme une veilleuse au bout de l'allée à l'odeur amère. Une pensée d'or descend d'un vol triste en a fermé les persiennes sur des chambres où les idylles sont mortes. The bird, troubled by some secret of the islands and yet concealing it, picks up its song and its basketry of gold. A terrace of autumn, a white villa placed like something on the watch at the terminal of the walk in the bitter odour. A thought as of gold falls down with sad descent. The blinds have been drawn in the rooms in which the idylls are dead. This kind of poetry is meaningful, but it is not literal. It is certainly lyrical, and this again makes it fall foul of the canons of current poetry. Lyricism and the kind of passion and the kind of rhythm that go with this kind of poetry are now absolutely excluded from the current canons of poetry. Poetry tends to be extremely simplistic, extremely lacking in feeling, in what psychoanalysts call affect, and extremely flat. This is poet Leon Paul Fargue very much believed in the idea, I think it was Schopenhauer's, that all arts aspire to the condition of music. The phrase pour la musique is one that he uses a great deal. He's also very fond of idioms connected with light and dark. One critic said his favourite word was la lampe, the lamp. And I think this is the whole point of the kind of poetry that he wrote. He was not the first, nor the last poet to celebrate the streets of Paris. Baudelaire probably was the first, and he had a reputation of being a stroller. There is no exact word in English. A stroller doesn't really exist in English. Fargue's most famous book was Le Piéton de Paris. We're not going to translate that, I think, as the pedestrian of Paris, and the stroller of Paris isn't really good English. And strangely, this book, although extremely popular and regarded as one of his most important books, has never actually been translated into English. His successor was Jacques Derrida, who again wrote poems about Paris and books about Paris. And this is a tradition that simply does not exist in England. Prose poetry does not exist in English. I tried, and I don't think I was very successful at this medium. And certainly my poetry is written very much in place, in the sense of a sense of place, in the way Wordsworth wrote about the Lake District, in the way that Ted Hughes wrote about Yorkshire, and I feel that my work has been largely overlooked because it is about the area around what would now be regarded as inner city Leeds. Or there are other poems about Paris and about the Yorkshire Moors, but I think this sense of place is something which is hugely absent in the canon of current English criticism about poetry. if you look at the kind of poets that are very successful today, there is no sense of place whatsoever. There is certainly no sense of lyricism, there is no rhythm, there is no passion. Poems are somehow regarded as reflections, almost like a mirror reflection of some very tiny segment of reality, and the subject can never be the ego. This is what postmodernism is about, the extinction of the individual ego. That poetry somehow becomes impersonal. Quite why this has happened, I don't know. Certainly the French New Novel under Fargue was impersonal in this sense, but I came across a short story by Fargue in which he describes a sandy beach and two sets of footsteps going from one end to the other. And it is true in a sense this is a mirror, but it's more a prose poem than a short story. It's perfectly balanced, and it is absolutely great art. But quite how this has been transposed and metamorphosised into English language poetry, by English language I mean American poetry and all poetry written in English, it's somehow taken a wrong direction, just as poetry in general in the English-speaking world took a wrong direction when it left Pound and took up William Carlos Williams, who was noted for his short, abrupt lines and for precisely to me one good poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, and perhaps the poem about stealing plums from his wife's fridge. The tradition of Pound and Eliot, which looked to the 19th century, and in Pound looked to Provençal in the 14th century, the troubadours, is something now that is totally missing from English poetry. I think this is a huge failure of nerve and a huge reduction of the capacity of poetry to go into a place, into a street, into a deserted street, on the outskirts of a city, and look at the debris there under the lights, in the rain. This is the kind of thing that Reda and Fargue, and before them, the other great 19th century poets in France, would do and would celebrate. Now everything has to be political, and it is very difficult to write a political poem. Poems nowadays are either political in a kind of politically correct sense, or they're simply reflective mirror images. And just as in a sense portrait painting was replaced by photography and became irrelevant, it is as though in language we've gone backwards, and now we're at a stage where a kind of photography in black and white is replacing the vibrancy and the music of rhythm and lyricism and passion. It is a very, very unreadable poetry. And the reason why people, amongst other reasons, don't read poetry is it is exceedingly boring. There is no narrative structure. People don't think of writing long poems, they don't think of writing narrative poems, they don't think of writing lyrical poems, they don't think of writing love poems. Poems are extremely slight in content. I think this is a total and absolute disaster. You don't really... Fargue was such a great poet that you don't actually really have to choose a particular poem. It doesn't matter which poem you read, because they are all very, very good. In Rhodes' brief article, he says that the intelligence in the man caught up with the susceptibility in the child. His disposition to daydreaming persisted, extended, expanded, and rose in him at the same time, however, until it overflowed and spread over the fertile soil in the poet. The soil itself came from a flower garden in a city backyard. And that to me is what poetry is